are some of the things you ask dentists to be aware of as they're transitioning others into their practice?
The first thing we look at is does your practice have the ability to bring another person in and be able to feed some patients to that person and help them become successful on a fast track. And so the first thing that needs to be done is to appraise the practice's capacity to add another dentist. And lots of transitions have failed because they really didn't have a legitimate place for the person to come into because the practice wasn't large enough, or their schedule, they still wanted to work full-time themselves, and so on. So that's where you begin. That's the first step.
Okay, and when you look at some of the key indicators that would allow a practice to be in a position to transition in, what would be some of those key indicators?
One of them would be the size of the active patient base. And if the owner dentist, the host dentist, plans to continue to practice for a number of years and plans to continue to practice at a similar pace to the way they're currently going, then you've got to have an overflow and in order to feed the other party. So that's one. The facility. Do you have an ability to practice side by side with that incoming doctor, and do you have the ability to add some team members and expand your personnel and still do it within the suite? It's not a good idea to add somebody, for example, and split shift it right from the beginning, because you're never together and they never get it.
Now, when it comes to, there's a couple things. When it comes to the amount of flow, is there any indicator as far as number of patients? Obviously, it would probably depend on the style of practice, but is there anything that you're looking at as far as number of patients that would be a good indicator that this practice is ready to add another person to the practice?
A baseline indicator would be, do you have the ability in a general practice to feed 300 to 500 patients to that new dentist the first year without hurting yourself? Okay. You have the ability to do that, because it makes no sense to bring a second doctor in and just move part of your production over into that schedule and have your own production crater. But if you have the ability to feed people to that person out of active patients and out of a pro rata share of new patients, then that'll work.
Okay. And when you do bring somebody else in, like you had mentioned, it's not good to stagger the schedule. It's usually really a good practice to make sure that the associate is practicing at the same time that you are, say, in similar hours.
Yes.
In a facility that has the ability to accommodate that, correct?
Really important. It's really important because every practice has its own personality and its own culture. And in order for the new person to assimilate into that culture, they have to understand it. And the only way they can do that is to be there in prime hours. Not to have an A team and a B team or a varsity and a junior varsity. That doesn't work. People way too often bring the new doctor in, hire a new assistant, give the new doctor the new assistant, and all of a sudden, rather than a team, you have us and them. The veterans and the new guys. And that, I don't recommend that at all.
Okay. Now, you brought up a very important point. You said the word culture, the practice culture. I think that's absolutely crucial in your practice, whether you're practicing by yourself or someone else and with the rest of your team. Talk about the practice culture. How important is that in transitioning?
I think it's everything. I've done a couple thousand practice transitions with dentists in my career. Every one of them have had the same basic fundamental elements in them, but every one has been different. And the reason that every one has been different is because the personality of the owner is different. And the culture reflects the personality, the core values, and the core philosophies of that owner. You eventually attract staff to your practice who reflect those same values, and you attract patients to your practice who respect and reflect those values.
So when you're bringing somebody into the culture, if it was a new prospective dentist, what would be some of the things you would ask this dentist to see if our value systems match up?
The first thing I do, even before I got into interviewing a candidate, would be to sit with the team and have a session and talk about who is an ideal candidate for our practice. What sort of qualities and what sort of skills and attributes and values do they need to bring to this environment in order to thrive here? And you're really putting together an ideal candidate profile. And you can't work without that profile. So before you go out, as you package your opportunity and go out to the marketplace to begin to look for an appropriate person to come, have that template in hand and have that in mind so that you'll recognize the right person when you meet them.
That's fantastic. So create this profile of who the ideal candidate would be, and maybe this would be a great point to put in an example of this into the video. Here's an example of what a profile would look like. Develop it with your team so that when you start interviewing people, you'll know this person when you find them.
Exactly.
Now, when you start interviewing, what are some of the things that you're looking for? And once you have this profile in front of you, what would be some of the things that you're going to be looking for in a prospective candidate?
Before we start talking about the specifics of the practice or the specifics of the opportunity itself, we asked all the questions about who are you, where are you coming from, where are you right now, what's your timetable, what's ideal for you, do you have a 5-year plan, do you have a notion in mind in terms of how you ideally would like to practice and what kind of lifestyle you'd like, and we start there. To really sound them out. Why did you become a dentist? It's a simple question, but it's a hugely important question. And the answer to that, I want to hear, without coaching or prompting, I want to hear something in their answer that says, I want to make a difference in other people's lives. You know, it's great to be smart in science and to be a great student with a perfect GPA and love all that stuff, and be good with your hands and all of those kinds of things. But the people who do best and are the happiest and most fulfilled in the profession are the people who have some helping themes in their lives.
Absolutely. Now, speak to the generational gap, because what you're going to see when you set up this process is you might see a mature dentist talking to a dentist that is more, maybe 1 generation or 2 generations away from them in where they're at. What would a mature dentist be very aware of the generational differences in a younger dentist coming into the practice when it comes to values, work ethic, all that type of stuff?
A great question. What every generation sees all other generations only through their own lenses. And this is the first time, Kirk, in the history of the United States where we've had 4 generations working together at the same time in the workplace. It's always been 3 up until now. Now we have 4, which makes it even all the more complex. So you need to try to understand what that person's values are and ask the kind of questions I was just describing and really try to get to know that person and see what's motivating them. It's so easy to generalize about generations. I remember I read an editorial about generational differences. There was an editorial in the Atlanta Constitution, and they talked about this next generation, the latest generation, is not going to do as well. It is not going to live up to the standards that have been set by prior generations, and so on and so forth. And that editorial was written in 1889.
Wow.
And so I think these themes have been around forever. Mm-hmm. I think they're more intense now, and there's more generational misunderstanding than there's ever been. But it's really important to just get to know them and try to understand them.
Okay. Here's a question I'm always curious about. When it comes to meeting the younger dentists that you might be transitioning in, what are some of the other things you're going to be looking for? If they have a spouse, are you going to want to meet the spouse? How many roots do they have planted in this community? Are they kind of sifting for an opportunity? Is this the place that they're going to be long term? What are some of the red flags that you might be looking for, or some of the green flags that you might be looking for somebody that you'd be transitioning?
One of the things I want to see and have to see for the benefit of my clients, if my client is the owner or host of the practice, is this a person you're dealing with who's capable, when they find what they want, are they really capable of making a commitment? And lots of people want to keep their options open. They're hooked on the notion that that's a good way to live, but it's not. If you keep your options open, you never make a commitment, and you never focus on something and get it accomplished. So that's a starter issue for me.
Okay. So now let's say you start to identify a couple. Well, before we identify, where would I go to start collecting prospects to bring into the practice? Because that's a question I get a lot. People think about, well, I'm going to bring in an associate or possibly a partner. Where do I start? Where would I start looking?
You're going to first of all package your practice opportunity. You're going to put together your ideal candidate profile. You're going to package and put a prospectus together on your practice. You're going to have a financial packet that you don't give to anyone unless or until they've surfaced as a really bona fide candidate, and then only after signing a confidentiality agreement. But you're going to have a practice profile that talks about the history of the practice, the history of the owner of the practice or owners of the practice, the team, the core philosophies, some of the systems and protocols in the practice, and the relative strength, and the mission and vision that relate to the practice, trying to identify some of that practice culture that we're talking about. The more specific you can make that prospectus, the more effective it is, because it will turn on the right kind of candidate when they see it and turn off the kind of person who's just not looking for something like that. And then you go on the websites, you go on the dental school websites, you go into residencies, you can get on residency websites, you can run traditional ads and do things like that. Every state has dental newsletters and things like that. It's not difficult, frankly, to come up with candidates to talk with. It is difficult to come up, to sort through them and land on the person that you really want, and then go sell them.
All right, so what would you say to a prospective dentist, or a dentist who's bringing in candidates? Speak about the number of candidates that are coming out of dental school. What are the trends, and what have you seen out there in the field?
Well, as you know, the number of graduates is really on the rise again, with new, after being at low levels for quite some time with the historic closing of dental schools earlier. So the number of people available and looking for opportunities is greater, and it's going to be greater than it has been. So I think that and these people have more places to look at, to go, than any generation has had, and in some ways fewer places to look at, to go, than any generation has had. So it's very confusing for the new graduates.
What we're going to see here is a lot more people with coming out with fewer opportunities to practice.
That's correct.
So that's a great opportunity for people looking to transition others in.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. We've had, in the past few years, since 2007, 2008, an awful lot of people who were ready to retire right in that time slot didn't, and are still practicing. So we're starting to see some movement now and some thawing of that situation, where people who ended up practicing another 5 years to rebuild personal portfolios, or because they just weren't ready, are now getting ready to retire. And so we're seeing some of that inventory come into the market, which is timely with the record numbers of new graduates coming out.
Awesome. Now, let's say you find the candidate. How do you start the engagement process? Let's say I meet with you, I like you as a potential dentist, I want to bring you into the practice. Where do I go next? What would be the next step?
We get to know all about them with telephone interviews and so on. We talk to them about where they want to be ideally, how they want to be practicing. What we find routinely with young people, with young dentists coming in, is they're not really aware of what some of the options and possibilities are. They may not have gotten a very clear view or a very broad view of what's out there from being in dental school. And in fact, they probably haven't. So they don't really know, for example, that there are many people who are still really thriving in fee-for-service private care practice. And they have all sorts of options to look at. Corporate dentistry, they can go in and just be employed somewhere while they're buying time to begin retiring their school loan debt and look for the right opportunity. We see lots of people like that. A really strong percentage of people are going into residencies, which helps them prepare for private practice or for practice. And it also gives them more maturity, and they come in much stronger that first year when they do get into an opportunity. So it's a really there's a wide variety of opportunities there.
Sounds good. Now, when you bring them in, where would you start? Would you start in a probationary period? Maybe come visit my office?
I would have, before we get to the probationary period, I would do that, yes, by the way. But in the process itself, in the interview process, if they're married or getting married or have a significant other, I absolutely want that person involved in the process. So that person is not getting secondhand information in a biased way. If I would rather have them at the table hearing it all from me and from the other advisors and from and being part of the live conversations than to have them get it secondhand. It's much, much better. If they're a stakeholder, they're going to be an influencing decision maker. And if they're a stakeholder, they deserve a spot at the table.
Okay. So have a meeting with the significant other. Then when you bring the dentist in, how would you do that? How many, is it a week-long process? Is it a month?
I would bring them in and have them visit the practice and spend at least a couple, 3 days in the practice and in the community looking around. What people want to do is they want to know, what are the schools like, where are the churches, what is the community like, what is housing like. They can get an awful lot of that information on the internet, but they're going to want to do that and really look around. But at the same time you're exploring, it's really critical that they come in and get exposed to and take the measure of this culture we've been talking about. And see, does that fit me? Is that who I am? And in the same token, the team, as they're looking at they're a really important part of this interview process and the transition process, of course, the team is. And they start to form impressions and opinions by spending time with candidates. And their opinions really matter in this process because they're the ones who are going to have to make this work and be successful. And so they need to own the selection.
When they come in, how do I start an associateship agreement with them early on? I mean, right away, or do you have them come in and just see 1 or 2 days a week a patient? Patients. How typically what's a successful transition look like?
I would like for the whole plan to be on the table. For example, if the purpose of bringing the associate into the practice is for that person to take an equity position in the practice, buy in at some point, or buy the owner out, then that needs to be part of the plan. We need to be talking about the practice value as it is now and then update it later. We need to be talking about what the employment agreement is going to look like, the associate contract. We need to be talking about what constitutes a successful associateship. Specifically in this practice, what would constitute a successful first phase of the relationship, which is the non-ownership phase. And I think you put the employment agreement together and then bring them in and have them be, you can have a probationary period of 120 days or something like that. I recommend that, but you put their compensation package together, their benefit package, and you put together a plan to help feed them and make them productive right from the opening bell, and you coach them on the notion that the ideal way for them to come in is to receive the benefit of those patients that are going to be shared with them, but to come in and approach this opportunity as though they're doing a scratch start, because they are responsible for generating their own referrals from the opening bell as well.
Yeah, I hear a lot of people use the phrase "eat what you kill."
Yes.
Temperament, so that it gets away from the entitlement temperament.
Absolutely.
Help people understand when you come in here, it's not like we're just going to feed you. You've got to make your own way, and you've got to create your own level of value in addition to what the practice value is going to bring to you.
The worst thing you can have is to have somebody who comes in, sits back on their haunches, and waits to be fed. That's the worst outcome you could have. That's not somebody with fire in their belly. That's not somebody who's going to be a good owner, and that's not somebody who's going to make that commitment to buying in. They might be easy to have around, but they're not a good candidate to own. Sometimes the ones who are the best candidates to own are a little more difficult to have around, in that I'd rather have, for example, somebody driving me crazy with asking so many questions rather than have somebody who never asks any.
Yeah.
And with that person sitting back waiting to be fed in their dental job, I think that's deadly.
Dentistry is an amazing profession, and if you do the due diligence of doing your homework before you start the transition process, it can set you up for tremendous success. And anything you would add to that, Paul? Any closing thoughts that you'd have on transition?
An architect never works without a blueprint. A dentist should never do a transition without a transition plan. And the transition plan is something that talks about what their personal plans are and timetables, and what their practice plans are for making a successful transition, and the timetables for that. So for example, if I'm going to practice another 5 years and I want to bring somebody in before that time, I've got a couple different options. I can bring somebody in the 4th year and then phase out, practice together my last year and phase out. Or if my practice is large enough, I can bring somebody in now. And then I can bring a second person in when I'm actually ready to exit and convert it into a 2-doctor practice, if the practice is substantial enough and dynamic enough. So there are so many options that are available, and one of the really key critical things is to be enlightened and aware of what those options are. Otherwise, there's a tendency you just copy your buddy down the street and what he did with his transition. And that's not a good plan.